Picture this. You are handed a manila folder. Inside is a stranger's life. Same job, same car, same vacation spot, same handwriting almost. You'd assume you were looking at your own file by mistake. But you're not. You're looking at someone you have never met. And somehow his life is a mirror of yours. That's not a thought experiment. That actually happened. Twice in one family 39 years apart. And what it revealed about you is far stranger than anyone expected. In 1979, two men named Jim met for the first time since infancy. They had been separated as babies and adopted by different families in Ohio, never told about each other. When they finally sat across a table, they realized the coincidences weren't going to stop at their names. Both had been named James by their adoptive parents, without knowing the other existed. Both grew up doing carpentry and mechanical drawing as hobbies. Both married a woman named Linda, divorced her, and married a second wife named Betty. Both named their childhood dog's toy. Both drove the same model Chevrolet. Both vacationed on the same 3-block stretch of a Florida beach at different times without ever meeting there. Both bit their fingernails down to nothing. Both suffered from tension headaches that started at the same age in their early 20s. Both smoked the same brand of cigarettes. Sit with that for a second. What are the odds? This wasn't folklore. It reached a psychologist named Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota, and it became the seed of one of the most ambitious studies in the history of psychology. Bouchard didn't just study the two Jims. He built an entire research program around identical twins separated at birth, called the Minnesota Study of Twins Reared Apart. Over the next 20 years, his team studied more than 100 pairs of twins raised apart, from infancy to adulthood, comparing everything from IQ to fears to the exact way they laughed. Here's what you need to understand before this gets stranger. Identical twins share 100% of their genes. That part isn't news. What was news in the late 20th century was how much of a person's personality, interests, even their specific quirks, tracked with genetics rather than upbringing. Before Bouchard's work, the dominant belief among psychologists was that environment did almost all the heavy lifting. Raise a child in a certain home with certain values and you get a certain person. Nature loaded the gun, but nurture pulled the trigger, or so the thinking went. The Jim twins broke that model wide open. Because here's the thing. These two men were not raised in the same house. They were not raised in the same city. They didn't know the other existed until they were 39 years old. And yet their lives ran on almost identical tracks, down to the brand of beer they preferred and the way they arranged furniture in their homes. Bouchard's broader twin study found something almost as strange as the Jims themselves. Across dozens of twin pairs raised apart, researchers found that traits like extroversion, how anxious a person tends to be, even how conservative or liberal their political views leaned, showed measurable genetic influence. One study from Bouchard's team estimated that general intelligence was roughly as heritable in twins raised apart as in twins raised together, which suggested upbringing mattered less for that particular trait than almost anyone expected. Now, here's where you need to slow down and be careful with this because it's the part people get wrong. This does not mean your life is written in your DNA like a script you're powerless to change. It doesn't mean free will is an illusion, or that your choices don't matter. What it means is something quieter and, honestly, a little eerier. It means that some of what feels like your personality, your specific preferences, even the tiny habits you think you invented yourself, may have been humming in your biology long before you ever made a single decision. Think about the last time you picked a favorite color or found yourself drawn to a particular hobby, or noticed you bite your nails when you're stressed just like the Jim twins did. You probably assumed you learned that somewhere. From a parent. From an experience. From trial and error. But twin studies suggest that a meaningful slice of who you are was set in motion before you ever had the chance to learn anything at all. Here's the twist that makes this even stranger than a story about coincidence. Not every trait lined up. The two Jims had different religious beliefs. One was more talkative than the other. Their parenting styles with their own children weren't identical. Across Bouchard's broader study, some twin pairs raised apart turned out to be strikingly different in areas like career choice or exact taste in art. Genetics wasn't destiny. It was more like a set of tendencies, a gravitational pull toward certain outcomes, that environment could still nudge, resist, or amplify. So what actually happened to the two Jims wasn't that biology overrode everything. It's that biology built the raw material, and two very different environments still managed to sculpt something recognizably similar out of it. Like two sculptors working from the same block of marble in separate studios, never speaking to each other, and somehow arriving at nearly the same statue. Which brings you back to yourself. You are not a twin separated at birth, most likely. But you are still carrying around a nervous system, a temperament, a baseline level of anxiety or curiosity or stubbornness, that was largely in place before you could talk. The version of you that gets restless in silence or feels calm near water, or can't stand small talk, isn't entirely a product of your childhood home. Some of it was already loaded in, the way it was loaded into two strangers named Jim who had never met. This is part of why identical twins raised in wildly different households so often report the same eerie sensation when they finally meet. They don't describe it as meeting a stranger who happens to look like them. They describe it as meeting themselves. Researchers who've interviewed reunited twins since Bouchard's original study have noted a common phrase among them. It felt like finding a missing piece they didn't know was gone. And this is where the story stops being about two men in Ohio and starts being about you. Every time you assume a habit is fully yours, fully chosen, fully earned through experience, you're leaving out half the picture. Somewhere in your biology, there may be a version of you living a different life in a different city, shaped by different parents who still somehow ended up biting their nails at the same age, or feeling drawn to the same kind of quiet beach town, or getting headaches on the same schedule. You'll likely never meet that version of yourself. But the Jim twins prove that version might exist anyway. So the next time you reach for a habit you think you built from scratch or fall in love with a hobby that feels like it came out of nowhere, ask yourself a different question than you usually would. Not just, why do I like this? But how far back does this actually go? Let's go back to that research team for a moment because the story doesn't stop with the two Jims. Bouchard didn't work alone. A psychologist named David Lucan joined the Minnesota project early on, and his work focused on something even stranger than favorite beers and dog names. Lucan studied what he called the set point of happiness, the idea that people have a baseline level of contentment they drift back toward no matter what happens to them. Win the lottery and you'll likely return to roughly the same mood within a year or two. Suffer a devastating loss and, eventually, you tend to drift back upward again. Lucan's research on twins suggested this baseline wasn't just a personality quirk. It looked biological, present in identical twins raised worlds apart, almost like a thermostat set before birth. Think about what that means for you specifically. That nagging sense that you're either a naturally anxious person or a naturally easygoing one, the one you've spent years trying to talk yourself out of, might not be a flaw in your character. It might be closer to your resting heart rate. Something you can influence, something you can work with, but not something you invented through bad decisions or a difficult childhood alone. Another researcher who joined the twin studies, a psychologist named Nancy Siegel, spent decades interviewing reunited twins after their first meetings, cataloging the small, uncanny details that kept showing up across dozens of separate pairs. Twins who had never met would show up to the airport wearing nearly identical outfits by accident. Twins would describe the same phobia, the same fear of heights or enclosed spaces, despite growing up nowhere near each other. Siegel's interviews painted a picture that went beyond the two Jims as an isolated fluke. It suggested a pattern running underneath dozens of human lives, one that had simply never been visible before scientists started actually looking for it. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. None of these twins were trying to replicate each other. They weren't performing a role. They had no idea the other person existed until adulthood. Whatever pulled them toward the same brand of cigarette, or the same career, or the same 3-block stretch of Florida coastline, was an imitation. It was already running quietly in the background of who they were, waiting for an environment to switch it on. This is where the story loops back to something bigger than twins entirely. You've probably had a moment where you did something and thought, why do I always do that? Maybe you interrupt people when you're nervous. Maybe you need silence before you can fall asleep. Maybe you've never once in your life enjoyed a crowded room, no matter how hard you tried to convince yourself you should. You likely built a story around that behavior. Something about your parents, or a memory from childhood, or a lesson you taught yourself the hard way. And that story might even be true in part. But underneath it, there may be a much older, much quieter cause, one that had nothing to do with your memories at all. That's the real reframe hiding inside the Jim twin story. It isn't just a curiosity about coincidence. It's a quiet challenge to how much credit or blame you assign to your own upbringing. For most of the 20th century, psychology leaned hard into the idea that you are the sum of your experiences. Change the environment and you change the person. The Jim twins and the 100+ pairs studied after them suggested the truth was Messier. You are the sum of your experiences acting on a foundation you didn't choose and can't fully see. And that foundation is more specific than most people assume. It isn't just broad traits like introversion or intelligence. Bouchard's team found matching results in oddly narrow behaviors too, things like the tendency to laugh at the same moments, to sneeze in twos, to feel uneasy in the exact same social situations. Small, almost embarrassing details that no one would ever think to inherit because no one imagined inheritance could reach that far into daily life. Which means somewhere in you right now is a habit so small you've never questioned it. The way you organize your closet. The way you hum without noticing. The specific joke you always make when you're uncomfortable. You've assumed you built that yourself, piece by piece, out of your own experience. The Jim twins suggest otherwise. They suggest some of it was there before you had a name for yourself, waiting quietly to surface the moment life gave it the chance. Because somewhere out there, in 1979, two strangers sat across a table from each other and realized their entire lives had already been living in parallel, long before either of them knew the other existed. You are not so different. You are just still waiting for the folder to be handed to you.